Well, the German election happened over the weekend, and it was won, of course, by Donald Trump. In a post on Truth Social, the President of the United States marked the election without naming the victor or his party, but instead giving himself a shout out. Much like the USA, the people of Germany got tired of the no common sense agenda, especially on energy and immigration, that has prevailed for so many years. This is a great day for Germany and for the United States of America under the leadership of a gentleman named Donald J. Trump. Congratulations to all, many more victories to follow. Meanwhile, the actual victor of the German election, the head of the CDU, Friedrich Merz, started his term by noting that Europe needed to make itself independent of the United States, and noting what should be obvious, but many are afraid to say out loud, that NATO is effectively dead, and may be officially dead within months, not years. He said this: "I never thought I would have to say something like this on a television program, but after Donald Trump's statements last week at the latest, it is clear that the Americans, at least this part of the Americans, this administration, are largely indifferent to the fate of Europe." It's worth noting that Merz has been known traditionally as an enthusiast and advocate for the US, having worked with and for American firms for much of his professional career. But, well, things have changed. On NATO, he said, "I am very curious to see how we are heading toward the NATO summit at the end of June. Whether we will still be talking about NATO in its current form, or whether we will have to establish an independent European defence capability much more quickly." He also had choice words about those who had tried to interfere in German elections. Intervention from Washington were no less drastic, dramatic, and ultimately no less brazen than the intervention that we have seen from Moscow. On Friday, Merz started putting form on a likely future discussion by suggesting that it was time to explore nuclear cooperation between France, the UK, and others. France and the UK both have nuclear weapons, and he argued that they could be involved in replacing the American nuclear umbrella that has previously been part of Europe's defence against Russia. That's not a straightforward proposition, but the fact it's being floated tells you now that this is going to start picking up in earnest. For most European leaders, of course, the most significant meaning of the day today is that it's the anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A number of European leaders gathered in person in Kyiv, along with Justin Trudeau for Canada, joined by a video link by various other leaders to mark the occasion. And one of the big questions they will have been discussing, on the sidelines at least, would be, should Trump simply pull from Ukraine in disgust at its refusal to surrender on demand, and it's seen as more likely than not? Can European support alone keep Ukraine in the fight? This rather depends. The valid critique of the Allies by the Trumpists has been that there was no real strategy that outlined a potential successful end to the war over the last 3 years. Support for Ukraine was always just enough to keep them going, never enough to give them a chance of winning. So what Europe can't afford to do is simply step in to keep the status quo solo with no end in sight. Some have argued that behind the scenes, Russia's economy is becoming more and more fragile under the weight of the war and the international sanctions levied against them. May be true. Nobody saw the collapse of the Soviet Union coming. These things can happen very suddenly. But we also know that there is widespread sanctions avoidance, and the energy resources of Russia have kept it going pretty effectively. So hinging on any new strategy and holding on for a bit longer, hoping that Russia will collapse tomorrow, it would be a risky strategy, even if nothing had changed. But of course, If Trump drops sanctions against Russia or otherwise finds ways to bring it in from the cold, then a lot has changed and the timeline would disappear. That's even assuming it doesn't go the other way, with the US starting to level aggressive tariffs against Europe until and unless they drop their sanctions against Russia. We are into a new world where such things are not beyond the bounds of possibility, and nobody seems to be completely prepared for any of it. So Europeans are seeing themselves with a bracing new task, building strength and independence in their own right. Something you would think should be achievable by such a collection of relatively wealthy, historically strong countries, but that they do without any sort of collective leadership, and which they contemplate doing from a standing start. Now, it could be more nuanced than it looks over time. Right now, it looks like Trump has come roaring in, established the new world order at a stroke, is surrounded by powerful loyalists, and you can just expect 4 or 8 more years of the same. Now, that would require political gravity to be abolished in the United States. Realistically, probably not going to happen like that. Some are putting it more strongly. Democratic strategist James Carville is telling Democrats to sit back, not get involved, and let the Republicans damage themselves. He believes the Trump edifice will collapse within 4 to 6 weeks, leading to massive losses by Republicans in the midterm elections. There may well be a fair helping of wishful thinking in that prediction, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. We're already seeing some of the Trump-appointed heads of agencies, such as at the Department of Defense and the FBI, kicking back against Elon Musk's latest email to all federal workers telling them to list 5 things that they achieved last week or else be fired, and with the implied threat that if the 5 things aren't considered impressive enough, maybe they'll get fired anyway. So just 1 month in, we have dissent within the ranks and pushback. Also across the country, you're now getting human stories of the veterans who were doing various jobs serving their country, who were highly esteemed and considered to be doing good jobs, who have been summarily fired, and all of them have been told it was because of performance issues. A number of Trump supporters and voters saying things like, "I support efficiency, I support removal of waste, but what they've just done to me or to my friends is random and cruel." Remember, this is a feature, not a bug. They're on record as saying they wanted to make the life of civil servants hell. The thing is, if you're firing hundreds of thousands of people across the country, it guarantees that every local news, every local media outlet will be seeing some of these stories. It means that many people will know of someone directly who was not deserving of being fired, who was treated badly. That sort of narrative starts to build up, especially when you show no signs of tempering the tone of what you're doing, to even acknowledge the downside that it's having for a lot of real people. Add to that the fact that firing firemen and safety officers and air traffic controllers and all these people who in one way or another are employed to prevent bad things from happening, the administration has put itself firmly in the crosshairs for the next disaster to take the blame. Some Democrats would have you believe this is all kicking in big time already, with Trump approval ratings plummeting, they're saying. I think that's overstated right now. Trump's approval ratings look like they're doing what you would expect once the honeymoon bump is over. They're starting to revert back to the mean. So don't get carried away. This is a potential problem for them, but it's not been triggered just yet. But as I've said before, the challenge of doing a flood of big consequential things in your first month in an attempt to flood the zone and keep your opponents from being able to keep up with all the things you're doing is that many of those things will have big unintended consequences, and suddenly you'll find those consequences all coming back at you in at least the same level of flood that you sent out. And the danger is that you become overwhelmed by what you yourself put into motion. And the world will look a little different should that happen. Right now, yes, Trump is riding high. The farthest right parties in a number of European countries are modelling themselves on his winning approach, attracting the endorsement of Elon Musk and JD Vance and seeing that as a good thing. He seems invincible. People are actively lobbying for how could we get past that pesky constitution to get a third term? But if Trump becomes a beleaguered president, caught in a trap of his own making, and the midterms deliver crushing defeats to anyone associated with his brand, well, that's all going to change extremely quickly. The likes of JD Vance will start trying to find ways to distinguish themselves from the boss rather than associating themselves with him. Talk of a third term will magically disappear. The Constitution will suddenly be rediscovered. And while Trump retains full ability to do what he wants on the international stage up to the end of his term, something of the power and inevitability of his changes becomes open to question if he's tanking at home. None of that will stop Europe from removing itself from dependence on the US. Lessons have been learned. None of that will stop allies who Trump has alienated, never trusting the US again in the same way they once did. But it could mean that while America will never be the same, it might tack back from the extremes, which is more likely than the vision that Trump goes on for 4 years triumphant, then JD Vance or Donald Trump Jr. steps into his shoes, similarly triumphant for yet another 2 terms. In the meantime, Europe should expect to be attacked rhetorically by MAGA. Trump's new worldview is the old might makes right worldview of Putin and Xi Jinping. They will carve out their respective spheres of influence, but neither of the dictators will want the MAGA revolution to end, since by and large it benefits them hugely. But Europe, by being more resistant to the demands of American tech giant corporations, by being less likely, in spite of the moment, to vote for the MAGA equivalents in their midst, and by presenting the main alternative vision of values and policies that push back against the MAGA vision, they are being seen as the real enemy. When JD Vance came to the Munich Security Conference and said that he was more worried about the enemy within in Europe than he was about Putin's Russia, well, that was literally true. What it meant, in addition, was that Trump and Vance see their internal opposition at home, quiescent as it may be now, as the real enemy to their task. Not Russia, not even China, but their internal political opponents. And because Europe is more aligned with the values of those opponents than anyone else in the world, Europe gets to be the butt of their verbal attacks as well. Unless they embrace the same political movements, of course, like the AfD. So that's Europe's challenge. A challenge that French President Macron will be taking on when he meets President Trump in just a few hours after recording this video. Should be interesting. 2 quick updates to recent stories. First, again, that Starlink story that I've discussed over the last couple of days. You will remember the original Reuters story said that 3 different sources in the administration had told them that removal of Starlink's internet services for Ukraine's military was being threatened to put pressure on Zelensky to sign the minerals deal. Yesterday, in my first update, I noted that Elon Musk had denied this, but at that stage nobody else had, so I said I was keeping a wait-and-see position. Since then, Pravda Ukraine has reported that President Zelensky said in a press conference that they had not been threatened directly with Starlink's disconnection, although it's something they are planning for should it happen. They're rather expecting it might do. He said this: "There have been no hints. We've seen that in the media. We do need to be prepared. Yes, the relevant institutions are working on this." Reuters have referenced their original story again in a separate one today, without noting Zelensky's comment, and hence holding their line that they stand by their original reporting. But since their original story did actually suggest that Zelensky had had the threat put to him twice by different Trump team representatives, I have removed my first video from this channel because I don't want to provide what may be misleading information. Still possible the Trump team were considering making the threat but didn't actually do so yet. but that's too speculative for my tastes. So far, I've seen none of the mainstream media outlets that picked up the story post any kind of note in relation to this, but no reason not to aim for higher standards on this channel, so I wanted to add that update here. As always, I'm trying first and foremost to work out what's true, and then work out what it means. Secondly, yesterday I talked about the coming fight over the United Nations resolutions on Ukraine to be voted on in the General Assembly later today. That fight is still shaping up as expected. The US has urged the General Assembly to vote against Ukraine and Europe's resolution and to vote yes instead to its alternative that doesn't mention Russian aggression nor Ukraine's sovereign territorial integrity. Britain and 24 European states have proposed an amendment to the US motion, putting those factors straight back into it. It seems on current reporting that China has not accepted a request by the US to move the Security Council meeting to before the main vote, but it will go ahead anyway with a separate vote on their motion after the main event. At that point, Britain and France will be faced with the choice of whether to use their veto against it or whether they'll let the vote happen as it will. None of these resolutions are binding, but they carry quite a lot of political weight, hence why all the fighting over them. I'm guessing that with Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer both meeting Trump this week, apparently still with the fond belief that they can talk him around to their view, bless, neither will risk wielding the veto and thence infuriating him. As a guess, not a prediction, as always, we will wait and see.